Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're navigating the intricate and frankly high-stakes landscape of the Middle East in May 2025.
It really feels like a region at a tipping point.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
marked by ongoing conflicts, rapidly evolving alliances, and just a flurry of diplomatic activity.
Yeah, quite a bit happening.
So our mission today is to really pull out the crucial insights from our sources around four interconnected pressure points.
Okay.
First, the agonizing and seemingly intractable Israel-Palestine conflict, with a particular focus, of course, on the unfolding crisis in Gaza. Second, the persistent and, adapting influence of Iran across the region.
Right, always a factor,
Third, the ever-shifting sands of global oil politics and their regional impact.
which is huge.
And finally, the overarching implications of all this for international peace and security. It's a complex picture, so let's get right to it.
Yeah, definitely. And what's immediately striking, I think, when you look at the current situation is how these different pressure points aren't really operating in isolation.
No, they're feeding each other.
Exactly. The tensions are feeding into each other, creating a really, really volatile mix.
Absolutely. And perhaps nowhere is that volatility more apparent right now than in Gaza. Operation Gideon's Chariots.
Yeah.
It continues. Can you sort of break down what's driving this operation and what the stark realities are for people there?
Yeah. Operation Gideon's Chariots, it has multiple stated objectives for Israel. Securing long-term control over Gaza, dismantling Hamas's capabilities, both military and, in terms of governance, and ensuring Hamas doesn't control the flow of humanitarian aid. That's the official line.
But the human cost.
Oh, the cost in human lives for Palestinians has been staggering. Just staggering. The Gaza Health Ministry reports over 53,000 deaths since October 2023, and there was a horrific spike just in the past week.
Good grief.
And tragically, UNICEF estimated back in March, which feels like a long time ago now, that around 100 children were being killed or maimed every single day. It's just difficult to even comprehend those numbers. And the access to basic necessities, it seems to have completely collapsed.
Sadly, yes. Since early March, Israel has imposed what amounts to a near-total blockade on essential supplies: food, fuel, desperately needed medicine.
So famine conditions.
Pretty much. This has created widespread famine conditions. UNRWA's reports, they paint a grim picture. Exhausted food supplies, the vast majority of medical essentials just unavailable.
And the international classifications.
They're alarming. The entire population is facing at least a crisis level of food insecurity, and nearly 500,000 people are in what's termed catastrophe, or actual famine conditions.
And the projections.
Looking ahead, projections suggest tens of thousands of young children are at risk of acute malnutrition. And the healthcare system, it's decimated. Key facilities like the Indonesian hospital, the European hospital, which was the only center for cancer treatment in Gaza, they're now closed.
And people forced from their homes.
Yeah.
The displacement numbers must be enormous. It's on an enormous scale. Around 90% of Gaza's population, close to 2 million people, have been internally displaced. Many, many times over.
Wow.
There are even reports of Israeli plans to sort of divide Gaza into separate zones for relocating civilians.
And getting aid in.
Compounding all this is the immense difficulty in getting humanitarian aid to those who need it most. I mean, despite the introduction of a U.S.-backed aid mechanism,
Right, remember.
major concerns remain within the UN and other aid organizations. Is it sufficient? Could it be used for unintended purposes? Are there political strings attached?
Yeah.
The fact that Israeli authorities reportedly denied the majority of coordinated aid deliveries in early May, that really underscores the scale of the problem.
Israel argues, though, that these restrictions are leverage, right, a way to pressure Hamas to release the hostages. Is that actually working? And what's the wider international reaction?
That is the core of Israel's stated rationale, yes. However, the severe humanitarian situation has led to just widespread international condemnation of Israel.
Which could backfire.
Paradoxically, yeah, it could actually limit its operational space. Furthermore, the sheer desperation in Gaza, it carries the significant risk of further radicalization, which could potentially undermine Israel's long-term security, even if it achieves its immediate aims against Hamas.
Amidst all this horror, are there any signs of diplomatic progress? What's happening with the ceasefire talks?
Well, negotiations are ongoing in Doha. Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. are mediating.
Okay.
The central proposal on the table seems to be a temporary 2-month ceasefire. The idea is to allow for deeper discussions on, a permanent cessation of hostilities, a release of hostages, and an Israeli withdrawal.
But Netanyahu's stance was initially Very hard line.
Very firm, yes. Initially, Prime Minister Netanyahu adopted a very firm stance, rejecting any halt to operations until Hamas was, quote, decisively defeated. He viewed any ceasefire as purely temporary, just for hostage release, with military actions set to resume afterward.
But there were reports recently making a slight shift, a softening.
That's right. By mid-May, there were some indications, some hints of a more flexible approach emerging from the PM's office, suggesting they were exploring all potential deal structures, including one that could potentially lead to an end to the war.
But with conditions.
Big conditions, yeah. Reportedly still contingent on the exile of Hamas fighters and the full release of all remaining hostages. And, importantly, this coincided with the IDF stepping up its offensive in Gaza.
And Hamas's position.
Hamas, for its part, has been pretty consistent. They demand a lasting ceasefire, a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and the release of a larger number of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the hostages.
Right.
They've also floated the idea of maybe a technocratic administration taking over governance in Gaza, but only if there's a guaranteed permanent end to the conflict.
So the fundamental disagreement really boils down to what happens after any initial ceasefire, doesn't it? The permanence issue.
Exactly. That's the core sticking point. The permanence of any ceasefire and the ultimate end state. Is it Hamas disarmament and exile? Or is it a full Israeli withdrawal? Those are fundamentally opposed views right now.
And the mediators.
There have been reports of frustration, particularly among the Qatari mediators, regarding the level of Israel's engagement in the talks. It's slow going.
And the hostages. The human tragedy there continues.
It's incredibly sensitive. An estimated 58 are still held. And tragically, Israeli intelligence suggests that perhaps only around 23 may still be alive as of mid-May.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And the separate U.S.-Hamas diplomacy that led to Eden Alexander's release earlier in May, that just highlights the complexities and the different channels involved.
So launching this major military operation while negotiating, it's clearly a pressure tactic.
Oh, absolutely. The timing of Operation Gideon's Chariots alongside these negotiations is clearly a tactic to exert leverage, but it's a high-stakes gamble. Well, it endangers the remaining hostages, it risks alienating international partners even further, and it could potentially trigger a much wider regional conflict.
And the shifts in Netanyahu's rhetoric.
The subtle shifts we've seen, even if conditional, suggest maybe a recognition of these significant political costs for Israel. It's a very fine line they're walking.
In this conflict, obviously, it's sending shockwaves beyond Gaza, Egypt, and Jordan. They must be watching this with intense concern.
Intense is the right word. Their primary concern, undoubtedly, is the potential for a mass displacement of people from Gaza. That's something both countries are adamantly against.
Egypt especially seems caught in the middle.
Egypt's in a particularly delicate position, yes. They're balancing their alliance and aid relationship with the U.S. against, their historical support for the Palestinians and their own critical national security interests.
And the Philadelphia corridor incident didn't help.
No, tensions definitely flared after Israel gained control of the Philadelphia corridor. There were reports of Egyptian tank deployments in the Sinai and then counterclaims from Israel about treaty violations. It got tense.
But Egypt's also trying to plan for the future.
Yes, Cairo has put forward a significant Gaza reconstruction plan. Crucially, it's aimed at ensuring Palestinians remain in Gaza, which contrasts with some suggestions, perhaps floated by the U.S. And Egypt, of course, continues to play that vital role as a mediator.
An agent.
Jordan, given its substantial population of Palestinian origin, views any large-scale displacement as a direct threat to its own national stability and its demographic makeup. So Jordan has been consistently vocal in condemning Israeli actions and calling for a ceasefire and civilian protection.
What about the broader Arab world, the Arab League?
Yeah, so the Arab League has presented a fairly unified stance, condemning Israel's actions, reaffirming support for Palestinian rights, and proposing its own post-conflict reconstruction plans for Gaza.
Including that technocratic administration idea.
Right, which includes the idea of a temporary technocratic Palestinian administration. What's interesting here, I think, is the increasing assertiveness we're seeing from regional powers like Egypt and the Arab League.
Taking more initiative.
Exactly, taking more independent roles in seeking solutions. This could mark a potential shift away from the traditional dominance of external great powers in these matters.
What's driving that shift?
Probably a combination of things. The sheer scale and urgency of the crisis, maybe a perceived lack of effective external proposals, or perhaps controversial ones, and the crucial need for these countries to safeguard their own national interests, like preventing huge refugee flows and avoiding regional destabilization.
So more local ownership.
That's the potential upside. More sustainable, locally driven initiatives. But there's also the risk, of course, of fragmented efforts if these different frameworks aren't well coordinated.
Okay, let's zoom out to the global stage. The responses seem quite varied, sometimes even contradictory. How are the major international players reacting?
It's definitely multifaceted, the international reaction, and at times quite fractured, really reflecting the underlying geopolitical complexities we see everywhere now.
Let's start with the U.S., the Trump administration.
Under the Trump administration, the United States has been actively engaged, certainly. Envoy Steve Witkoff is involved in discussions. President Trump recently concluded that Middle East tour, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE.
But notably skipping Israel.
Notably not Israel, yes, which caused some comment. The U.S. is backing this new aid delivery mechanism for Gaza, pursuing direct nuclear talks with Iran, which we'll get to.
Right.
Intends to lift sanctions on Syria and has expressed, let's say, skepticism towards some established international institutions.
What about Europe, the EU, and the UK?
Significant concerns voiced from both. We saw that coalition of 7 EU member states, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Slovenia, Spain, Norway, jointly urging Israel to reverse its Gaza policies, lift the blockade, allow unimpeded aid.
Strong words.
Very. The Council of Europe even warned of deliberate starvation, and the EU itself has been discussing potentially suspending its association agreement with Israel.
And the UK?
The UK initially backed the January ceasefire and has grown increasingly alarmed by the aid restrictions. They still maintain their long-standing support for a Palestinian state, but, at a suitable juncture.
What about Russia and China? Their positions seem complex.
Russia is definitely navigating a complex path. On one hand, potentially strengthening ties with Israel under Trump, maybe. On the other, deepening cooperation with Iran.
And their presence in Syria.
Exactly. Their military presence in Syria remains a crucial factor influencing Israeli calculations. Russia has abstained on certain UN Security Council resolutions, sometimes alongside China.
And China. They brokered that Saudi-Iran deal.
They did, after that initial diplomatic push with the Beijing Declaration on Palestinian Unity last year. China has largely taken a step back from a leading role on this specific conflict. But they have publicly voiced support for the Arab League's proposals for Gaza's recovery and broader conflict resolution. And like Russia, China has also abstained on some key UN votes.
Which brings us to the United Nations itself, a central arena but facing challenges.
A central arena, yes, and a critical provider of humanitarian aid. But the Security Council is frequently deadlocked, as we know, due to divisions among its permanent members, especially on this issue.
And UNRWA on the ground.
UNRWA's work in Gaza is absolutely vital, indispensable even. Despite facing immense operational challenges, Israeli blockades, funding uncertainties, particularly with the U.S. withholding funds.
And senior UN officials have been quite outspoken.
Very outspoken in their criticism of the aid restrictions, people like Tom Fletcher. Plus, you have international legal bodies like the ICJ and ICC playing a role, with the ICC issuing those arrest warrants for Israeli leaders.
Right.
UN Secretary General Guterres has consistently advocated for a return to the January ceasefire terms, unimpeded aid, and a renewed push for a two-state solution. And interestingly, the U.S. has also called on the UNSC to support efforts for reunification and stabilization in Syria.
It really does paint a picture of, a very fractured international landscape when it comes to resolving this.
Precisely. That's the key takeaway. While there's widespread condemnation of the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, there is a significant lack of consensus on how to fix the underlying problems.
And the institutions seem paralyzed.
The paralysis within the UNSC and the perceived limitations of established multilateral institutions are quite evident. And the Trump administration's America First approach, favoring bilateral deals and these ad hoc coalitions, that's a major factor too.
Leading to these smaller groups.
Exactly. It's led to the formation of coalitions of the willing, or more informal minilateral groupings, like that statement from the 7 European nations. And you see a more assertive stance from regional bodies like the Arab League.
Is that necessarily a bad thing, this minilateralism?
Well, it can offer a degree of agility, maybe get things done faster. But it also carries the risk of uncoordinated, even competing initiatives, which can further complicate efforts towards a comprehensive, lasting resolution.
So it reflects bigger shifts.
Absolutely. It reflects this broader geopolitical trend towards multipolarity and a sort of questioning of the established post-World War II international order.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to Iran. Its network of regional proxies, the so-called axis of resistance, has been such a significant factor for years. How is that network holding up in the current climate, May 2025?
Well, Iran's axis of resistance groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq and Syria, it's definitely come under unprecedented pressure from late 2023 into early 2025. They've experienced some significant setbacks.
Like Hamas in Gaza.
For example, yes, Hamas in Gaza has been severely weakened by the sustained Israeli military operations since October 7th, 2023. You had assessments from the Israeli defense minister back in September last year suggesting Hamas as a military formation no longer exists.
Wow.
Now, they continued some policing functions after the January ceasefire, but many leaders have been killed or neutralized, and this ongoing operation, Gideon's Chariots, is aimed at dismantling them completely. Some analysts are saying Hamas is not an asset for Iran anymore and likely never will be again.
And Hezbollah.
Hezbollah in Lebanon has also been weakened, significant Israeli strikes throughout 2024. And crucially, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria back in December 2024 disrupted a critical land route for them.
Right, that supply line.
Exactly. There was that U.S.-brokered ceasefire in November 2024 that mandated a military repositioning north of the Litani River. The Lebanese armed forces claim they dismantled over 90% of overt military infrastructure south of the Litani by April-May this year and asserted control.
But Israel's still operating there.
Despite this, yes, Israel has continued operations against what it perceives as Hezbollah presence, and Hezbollah in turn has accused Israel of violating the ceasefire. So, still tense.
The Houthis in Yemen, though, that seems like a different story. Maybe stronger.
It's a more complex picture there, definitely. The Houthi movement has maintained, even consolidated, its control over most of Yemen's populated areas. And they've demonstrated a really significant, almost surprising capability to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb.
With drones and missiles.
Using drones and missiles against commercial vessels, even targeting locations way inside Israel. Israel has hit back with retaliatory strikes on Houthi ports. Some analysts do believe the Houthis have actually grown stronger during this period.
But peace talks could change that.
Potentially. Ongoing peace talks in Yemen could diminish Iran's ability to use them as a proxy against, say, Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. military has also conducted targeted actions against Houthi leadership and capabilities. So it's mixed.
And Iraq and Syria. The Assad collapse must be huge for Iran.
Oh, the collapse of Assad's government in December 2024 was a major strategic blow for Iran. No question. The dominant armed factions in post-Assad Syria are largely hostile to Iran reestablishing itself there.
But militias in Iraq remain.
Iranian-backed militias in Iraq do continue to pose a threat to U.S. forces. Their aim seems to be deterring U.S. strikes on Iran itself and pushing for a full U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. But despite these setbacks, the IRGC Quds force, Iran's external operations arm, is still believed to be largely intact and, importantly, well-resourced.
So Tehran thinks it can rebuild.
Tehran likely believes it can revive its network over time. There are even reports of Iran trying to recover debts from the former Syrian regime, with Iraq mediating.
So summing up the axis. Weakened but not gone.
Exactly. While the axis of resistance has demonstrably been weakened, especially Hamas and Hezbollah, and losing that Syria land bridge is significant, it's far from defunct, the Quds force remains active and capable. The Houthis and some Iraqi militias retain both the capability and the will to act.
Is Iran changing its approach?
We've seen some indications of Iran rhetorically distancing itself from certain proxy actions, maybe for plausible deniability, but the fundamental strategic imperative to cultivate and use these groups likely remains. Efforts to rebuild their strength are almost certainly underway.
This significant weakening of its key proxies, losing Syria, that must fundamentally change Iran's strategic thinking,
right?
Make them feel more vulnerable.
Absolutely. It has to. The substantial degradation of key proxies losing that Syria corridor, it significantly curtails Iran's forward defense strategy, its ability to project power. And yes, that inherently makes Iran feel more vulnerable.
So what are they doing about it?
What we seem to be seeing is a potential strategic recalibration, maybe a greater emphasis on bolstering Iran's direct territorial defenses. We see evidence like increased missile deployments around the Strait of Hormuz, more naval posturing.
And the nuclear talk.
And we're also hearing more open discussions within Iran about potentially modifying its nuclear doctrine if, and this is key, if the country were to face an existential threat.
A shift from proxies to homeland defense.
It suggests a potential strategic pivot, yeah. Less reliance on external proxies, more focus on homeland security, and developing more direct deterrent capabilities. And that could include the implicit or maybe even explicit threat of nuclearization.
Which makes the nuclear talks even more critical.
Exactly. A weakened Iran, feeling cornered, might be more inclined to cross that nuclear threshold if it feels its conventional deterrents are irrevocably compromised. It raises the stakes significantly.
Let's talk about sanctions. Economic pressure has been a key tool against Iran. What's the latest there in 2025?
Well, the Trump administration has been very clear, very forceful in reinstating and intensifying the maximum pressure strategy. Remember that February 2025 National Security Presidential Memorandum.
Targeting oil exports.
Right. Specifically targeting oil exports, international trade, the so-called shadow fleet of tankers, key Iranian officials like the oil minister, and also international entities and individuals helping Iran sell oil, including some Chinese companies and figures like Reza Zareb.
And the FATF blacklisting.
Adding to that pressure, yes, Iran was returned to the FATF blacklist back in October 2024. That was due to its continued failure to adequately counter terrorist financing, which is directly linked, of course, to its support for these proxy groups.
What's the economic impact been? Severe.
It's been severe, no doubt. Inflation surged past 37% by March 2025. The Iranian rial plummeted. I think it hit $1 million to the dollar at one point. The IMF is projecting only modest GDP growth for Iran this year, lagging way behind the regional average.
Even China feeling the pressure.
We've even seen some Chinese companies react to the increased U.S. pressure. There were reports of the Shandong Port Group banning U.S.-sanctioned tankers, so it has reach.
And the main goal is cutting off proxy funding.
That's the primary stated objective, yes. Curtailing Iran's ability to finance its regional activities and support its proxies. Now, as we said, intelligence suggests the IRGC Quds force still remains well-resourced, but
The sanctions must hurt.
there's no doubt they create significant financial constraints. They make it much more complicated for Iran to support its allies. However, there's always this ongoing debate about just how effective sanctions are in completely severing those funding flows.
Because Iran finds ways around them.
Given Iran's long history of utilizing covert networks, alternative financial arrangements, yeah, they're adept at finding workarounds.
So has maximum pressure actually achieved its main political or strategic goals beyond the economic pain?
That's the crucial question. Despite the significant economic hardship inflicted, the effectiveness of maximum pressure in achieving those broader goals, well, it appears quite limited.
The Quds force still funded.
As we noted, the Quds force reportedly still maintains substantial resources. And critically, Iran has continued to advance its nuclear program and its ballistic missile program, the primary targets of concern for the U.S. and its allies.
So Iran adapts. The resistance economy.
Iran has demonstrated a significant capacity to adapt through what it calls a resistance economy. That involves illicit trade, like the shadow fleet, and strategically deepening partnerships with other sanctioned nations like Russia, or major powers like China willing to buy its oil despite U.S. restrictions.
Can this kind of pressure backfire?
Extreme economic pressure, especially if it's perceived as aiming for regime change without offering clear diplomatic off-ramps. It often leads to unintended consequences.
Like what?
It can increase intransigence. It can create a greater willingness to engage in risky activities, more aggressive proxy actions, accelerating nuclear development, and potentially it can cause a domestic rally around the flag effect that actually strengthens hardliners within the regime.
Making them harder to deal with.
Exactly. Maximum pressure compels adaptive behaviors that become increasingly difficult for the U.S. and its allies to counter. There's a real risk that such a policy, without careful calibration and credible diplomacy, could inadvertently push Iran towards more desperate measures.
Including going nuclear.
Including accelerating its nuclear program as an ultimate guarantee of its security, especially if diplomatic avenues are perceived as entirely blocked or, disingenuous.
Which brings us back to those diplomatic avenues. The U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. What's the latest there?
Iran's nuclear program. It remains a central, highly contentious security issue, regionally and globally. The Trump administration's policy is unequivocal. Iran will not get a nuclear weapon.
Diplomacy first, but
Preference for diplomacy, yes, but they've consistently kept military options on the table. We saw the start of indirect U.S.-Iran talks facilitated by Oman in early 2025.
what's the U.S. demanding?
The core U.S. demand is simple. On the surface, they can't have a nuclear weapon. But that encompasses verifiably ceasing any pursuit, halting terror sponsorship, ending proxy wars. It's broad.
And Iran's public position.
Publicly, Iran maintains its program is exclusively for peaceful civilian purposes, and its right to enrich uranium is non-negotiable. Standard line.
But signs of compromise behind the scenes.
However, there have been indications of potential compromise. Iran has reportedly shown willingness to dispose of its highly enriched uranium stockpiles, restrict enrichment to lower civilian levels, but in return for immediate and comprehensive lifting of all sanctions.
And that regional consortium idea.
Right. There were also reports of Iran proposing a regional nuclear consortium involving Saudi Arabia, UAE, potentially enriching uranium on Iranian soil. Likely a way to keep some domestic enrichment but offer regional oversight.
Where does Iran actually stand now, capability-wise?
International estimates from late 2024 suggested Iran had enough highly enriched uranium for maybe 5 or 6 bombs. But importantly, U.S. DNI Avril Haines assessed in March 2025 that Iran was not then actively building a weapon. It had the material, not the weapon itself.
Still, reaching a lasting deal seems incredibly difficult. Major obstacles remain.
Oh, absolutely. Many analysts are deeply skeptical about diplomacy alone dismantling the program. They point to past experiences, the perception that Iran uses talks to stall while developing covertly.
And Iran won't give up everything.
It's also deemed highly unlikely Iran would agree to a comprehensive deal covering everything the U.S. considers malign, the missile program, regional interventions.
But the biggest obstacle, is it trust?
Beyond all the technical stuff, yes. The primary, perhaps insurmountable obstacle is that profound, deeply entrenched trust deficit between the U.S. and Iran.
The JCPOA withdrawal looms large.
The Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA left a legacy of deep skepticism on the U.S. side and Iran, deeply wary of new commitments without ironclad guarantees after the U.S. walked away. They might see current talks as just a U.S. tactic for more concessions or buying time,
Making any deal fragile.
This mutual distrust makes a verifiable, sustainable agreement exceedingly difficult, even if both sides see some strategic benefit in de-escalation. You have Iran insisting on immediate, complete sanction lifting versus the U.S. wanting a phased approach tied to verification and broader behavioral changes that's a fundamental impasse.
And domestic politics don't help.
Plus, you have significant domestic political constraints in both Tehran and Washington. Hardliner resistance in Iran, intense scrutiny, and the risk of reversal in the U.S. It makes any potential deal exceptionally fragile, susceptible to collapse.
Could that consortium idea help bridge the trust gap?
Iran's regional consortium proposal? It might be an innovative attempt, yeah. Bring in new stakeholders like Saudi Arabia or the UAE as potential guarantors, trying to mitigate that deep bilateral mistrust. It's an interesting angle, at least.
Iran isn't just dealing with the U.S., though. Its relationships with Saudi Arabia, Russia, China are also crucial, especially under this pressure. How are those evolving?
Absolutely. Iran has been actively cultivating, recalibrating these relationships as a direct response to sustained Western pressure.
Like with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
That rapprochement seems to be holding.
The relationship with Saudi Arabia has seen a notable improvement since that China broker deal back in March 2023. Saudi Arabia publicly condemned the Israeli attack on Iranian territory in October 2024. And they've maintained their stance. No normalization with Israel without a viable path to a Palestinian state.
Riyadh offering to mediate.
Riyadh has also indicated willingness to mediate between Tehran and Washington. And Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman visited Tehran in April 2025, likely seeking regional security assurances, maybe about potential attacks on Iran or the Yemen conflict.
But would Saudi Arabia stay neutral in a U.S.-Iran conflict?
That remains the open question, despite these positive developments.
What about Russia? Ties seem much deeper now.
Considerably deeper ties with Russia, yes, especially military and economic. They signed that new bilateral treaty in January 2025, joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, though not a formal defense pact.
And the Ukraine connection.
There are those reports of Iran supplying Russia with drones, maybe even missiles, for the war in Ukraine. Plus, Iran's set to join the Eurasian Economic Union Free Trade Area this year, 2025.
Though Russia in Syria is complicated for Iran now.
Right. Russia's continued military presence in Syria is a complex variable for Iranian interests post-Assad.
And China, still buying Iranian oil.
China remains a crucial economic partner, the largest buyer of Iranian oil, often defying U.S. sanctions. However, U.S. secondary sanctions do limit the overall trade volume, and Chinese direct investment in Iran still lags behind what goes into the Gulf Arab states.
But China played that key diplomatic role.
Key role in brokering the Iran-Saudi normalization, absolutely. And Iran became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, in 2023.
So this isn't just random outreach, it's a strategy, an eastward pivot.
Exactly. Iran's visibly strengthened relationships with Russia and China aren't just opportunistic. It looks like a coherent strategic adaptation to intense U.S. pressure, an eastward pivot to counter Western isolation and economic crippling.
What are the advantages for Iran?
The advantages are clear. Economic lifelines like oil sales to China, enhanced military cooperation, potentially accessing advanced weaponry from Russia, and crucial diplomatic support in forms like the SKO, maybe BRICS down the line.
A counterweight to the U.S.
These relationships provide a balance against perceived U.S. hegemony, definitely. And the improved Saudi relations, facilitated by China, also fit in seeking regional stability where possible, reducing active fronts, allowing Iran to consolidate resources.
Does it fully offset Western pressure?
Probably not fully offset Western sanctions, no. But these partnerships offer significant economic and diplomatic resilience. They prevent complete isolation and complicate Western coercion strategies.
Yeah. Let's turn now to the lifeblood of the region, in many ways, oil. We saw some significant price drops and market turbulence in early 2025. What drove that volatility?
Yeah, the oil market early this year was definitely turbulent. Brent crude prices dropped sharply, about $10 a barrel between March and early April. Touched four-year lows below $60 before bouncing back a bit to the mid-$60 by mid-April.
What caused the drop?
Primarily, it seems, deteriorating risk sentiment in global financial markets, think U.S. trade tariffs, mounting recession fears, and also OPEC+ decisions to actually increase supply.
And demand forecasts.
The IEA lowered its forecast for the average Brent price for 2025 compared to last year. And there are these growing concerns about weakening global oil demand playing a key role. Growth projections for 2025 were revised downwards, linked to U.S.-China trade tensions, new tariffs, broader economic slowdowns.
So, economic fears outweighing Middle East tensions.
It's this complex interplay, right? You have bearish macroeconomic sentiment versus potentially bullish geopolitical risks. Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Houthi attacks, Israel, Iran. But in Q1 and early Q2 2025, it looked like the big global economic worries and the OPEC+ supply increases had the more dominant immediate impact.
Capping prices.
Capping prices, yeah. Unless a Middle East conflict directly and substantially removed large volumes of oil from the market, like a Strait of Hormuz closure or major damage to Saudi or Iraqi production.
So the market wasn't expecting a major new disruption.
It seemed to be pricing in a continuation of existing conflicts without anticipating major new supply disruptions. But that balance is always precarious, very precarious.
And OPEC+ itself, obviously pivotal. What have their production policies been this year?
OPEC+ has definitely been central. They reaffirmed their strategy for a gradual production increase starting back in April 2025. The plan was to add about 2.2 million barrels per day over 18 months, roughly 120,000 barrels per day each month.
But then they accelerated.
Yes, then came a significant development on May 3rd. 8 key members, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, Algeria, Oman. They decided virtually to boost output by an additional 411,000 barrels per day just for June 2025.
Rolling increases into 1 month.
Effectively, yeah. Rolling 3 months' worth of planned increases into a single month. The stated rationale was healthy market fundamentals and low global oil inventories.
How did the market react?
Well, this OPEC+ decision to boost supply clearly contributed to that downward price pressure we saw. Many analysts saw it as maybe indicative of deepening tensions within the alliance.
Tensions. Why?
Well, they warned it could worsen oversupply concerns, especially given the weak demand outlook. Plus, there are ongoing issues with compliance reports of overproduction by Kazakhstan, UAE, Iraq.
Is OPEC+ addressing that?
OPEC+ indicated that mechanisms for compensating for this overproduction would be addressed and implemented. We'll see.
And non-OPEC supply.
That's the other key factor. Non-OPEC+ production is expected to see robust growth this year, maybe increasing by around 1.3 million barrels per day. That could potentially outpace global demand growth, leading to inventory buildup.
So why did OPEC+ increase production then? If prices were falling and demand was weak, it seems counterintuitive.
It points to a complex balancing act they're trying to manage. While they cited healthy fundamentals, you have to see it against the backdrop of member overproduction and strong non-OPEC+ supply growth.
A trilemma.
It suggests OPEC+ is navigating this trilemma: maintain price stability, defend market share, and ensure internal cohesion. It's tough.
Maybe prioritizing market share now.
The 2025 increases could signal a strategic shift towards prioritizing market share defense, possibly accepting lower short-term prices. It might usher in a more competitive phase if non-OPEC plus supply keeps growing strongly.
So internal challenges are key.
The group's ability to manage this balance is critical for future market stability, and those analysts' concerns about deepening tensions within OPEC plus, that's a significant indicator of the internal challenges the alliance is facing right now.
And it's not just about production levels, it's about actually moving the oil. Those maritime choke points are under serious pressure.
Absolutely. Key Middle East maritime choke points. They've become focal points of heightened tension, potential disruption in 2025. Huge implications for global trade and energy security.
Especially the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb.
Right. The Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait have been targeted by this systematic, well-planned Houthi campaign since late March, targeting international shipping, commercial vessels, oil tankers, especially those linked to the U.S. and allies.
How important is that strait?
The Bab el-Mandeb is critical. Nearly 10% of global maritime trade, over 30% of Europe-bound oil and LNG goes through there. It's vital.
What's been the impact of the Houthi attacks?
Substantial. Forced rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope adds 10-14 days, doubles transport costs, soaring insurance premiums. Some shipping lines just suspended operations temporarily.
And the Suez Canal.
Significant decline in Suez Canal traffic. Egypt even announced temporary transit fee discounts in May, citing alleged security improvements, though ongoing Houthi attacks kind of cast doubt on that.
And that missile near Ben Gurion.
That was an alarming escalation on May 4th. A Houthi missile reportedly striking near Ben Gurion Airport in Israel shows expanded range, potential intent.
What's the international response been?
There's the International Naval Coalition, Operation Prosperity Guardian, plus the EU's Operation Aspides trying to protect shipping. And the US and UK have conducted direct military strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen.
What about the other big choke point, the Strait of Hormuz?
We've seen increased Iranian military posturing there, reports of strengthened missile defenses on Iranian-controlled islands, more missile boats deployed.
Threats of closure.
Senior Iranian military officials, like General Bagheri in May, revived threats against international shipping, implying potential closure in response to provocations. Bagheri suggested prices could surge to $150–200 a barrel if that happened.
But are they actually posturing aggressively?
Well, observations of their naval deployments in May curtailed Red Sea presence. Largest vessels in port at Bandar Abbas suggested maybe a primarily defensive posture in the Gulf itself at that moment.
So what's a takeaway from these choke point pressures?
I think the 2025 Red Sea events, plus the persistent Hormuz tensions, they underscore this growing vulnerability of global trade to asymmetric threats targeting maritime choke points.
Non-state actors causing major disruption.
The Houthi campaign demonstrates that pretty clearly. Low-cost attacks by non-state actors can impose substantial economic burdens, strategic uncertainty, and Iran leverages the Hormuz threat as a potent tool of deterrent and coercive diplomacy.
And the international response isn't stopping it.
The response, costly deployments, airstrikes, hasn't eliminated these threats. It highlights how difficult it is to secure these corridors against persistent, adaptable attacks.
Forcing changes in trade.
It's forcing this recalculation of shipping routes, costs, protocols, potentially leading to a long-term increase in geopolitical friction affecting trade, and it empowers regional actors who can credibly threaten these choke points.
Long-term solution.
So in the longer term, yeah, these disruptions could spur investment in alternative routes, diversified supply chains, but those efforts are complex, costly, and take a long time.
Now, a major factor influencing all of this is the role of the United States. President Trump's recent tour in May 2025 that seemed quite revealing about U.S. engagement.
President Trump's Middle East tour in May was definitely noteworthy. The official visits to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, but that conspicuous absence of Israel.
Right, that raised eyebrows.
It did, particularly within Israel. Some interpreted it as a potential sign that Israeli interests might not be the absolute top priority during this period of intense Gaza conflict tension.
What's Trump's overall vision seem to be?
His overarching vision for the Middle East seems to center on pragmatism, pursuing economic prosperity, especially for the U.S., and establishing regional stability, but maybe on terms beneficial to American interests. He's been very clear about his disdain for past U.S. nation-building, citing Iraq, Afghanistan.
Focus on quick wins.
The administration's approach appears to prioritize achievable wins, tangible outcomes that can be presented quickly. deals.
Like the Syria policy shift.
In terms of specific policies, yeah, the Syria announcement was significant, lifting sanctions, normalizing relations with the new interim government under Ahmad al-Shura, who met Trump in Saudi Arabia.
Driven by Gulf allies.
Reportedly influenced by Gulf Arab leaders in Turkey, who see this new Syrian government as a potential counterweight to Iranian influence. Trump also invited Syria to join the Abraham Accords.
And the approach to Iran during the tour.
President Trump publicly extended that olive branch to Tehran for a nuclear deal, but it came with a stern warning the diplomatic opportunity won't last forever, and the threat of massive maximum pressure driving oil exports to zero if rejected.
While talks were ongoing.
Right, as U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was in the fourth round of those Omani-mediated talks.
What about Saudi-Israel normalization?
Trump encouraged Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel, but he added he hoped it would happen in your own time, acknowledging the Saudi position.
Which is tied to a Palestinian state.
Exactly. Saudi Arabia's consistent stance is recognition is contingent on significant progress towards a Palestinian state, which presents huge challenges given the current Israeli political climate.
In Yemen.
Trump mentioned the U.S. role in facilitating that fragile ceasefire with the Houthis, under which they reportedly agreed to cease attacks on U.S. vessels in the Red Sea. Unclear if that extended to Israeli-linked shipping.
But the big focus was deals, right?
Yeah.
Economic deals.
Huge emphasis on economic partnerships and deals. Official announcements talked about over $2 trillion in various agreements, investment commitments, a reported $600 billion Saudi investment in the U.S., a $1.2 trillion economic exchange agreement with Qatar, massive commercial and defense deals with Qatar and UAE.
So, analyzing this Trump foreign policy in 2025, it's very transactional, bilateral.
Heavily emphasizes bilateral agreements, yes. Tangible U.S. economic benefits. A pragmatic, flexible approach to shifting regional alliances like the Syrian engagement.
Less focus on traditional values.
It often seems to delink U.S. actions from traditional tenets like democracy promotion or strict multilateral adherence, especially if those are seen as hindering deals.
Syria is a prime example.
The Syria sanctions lifting, engaging with al-Shura. That looks like pragmatism driven by stabilizing Syria, potentially countering Iran, aligning with Gulf partners' preferences, and the massive economic deals underscore that economic dimension.
Iran approach fits too. Dialogue plus pressure.
Similarly, the Iran approach dialogue offer with pressure threat, and the Saudi-Israel stance encouragement without strong demands. They reflect this desire for breakthroughs on achievable terms that boost Trump's dealmaker image.
And skipping Israel.
The decision to bypass Israel on this tour further suggests a tactical focus on more immediately positive, deal-oriented engagements. This transactional approach is actively reshaping regional alignments. It encourages actors to frame cooperation in terms of direct U.S. economic or strategic, mainly anti-Iran interests.
So how are the regional players actually reacting to this? It must be causing some strategic shifts on their part.
Oh, absolutely. The Trump administration's distinct foreign policy is prompting varied reactions, strategic adjustments across the board.
Israel seems uneasy.
Israel has expressed noticeable unease, yeah. A growing sentiment that its core interests might not always align perfectly with the Trump White House priorities.
Intensified by the Houthi deal and Iran talks.
Reportedly intensified by that U.S. agreement with the Houthis, no explicit halt to attacks on Israeli-linked targets, and by the direct U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, fearing an insufficient deal. Plus, the Netanyahu government is facing huge domestic pressure over Gaza and increasing international isolation.
So Israel is hedging, looking to Russia.
Interestingly, yes, we've observed Israel's strengthening diplomatic and strategic ties with Russia, partly seen as a hedge against U.S. policy uncertainties, a desire to diversify partnerships.
What about the Gulf states? They seem central to Trump's plan.
The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, they're emerging as central partners in Trump's economic vision, key interlocutors in his diplomatic initiatives.
But they're hedging too.
At the same time, yes, these states are actively pursuing their own de-risking strategies, engaging in dialogue with Iran, diversifying security and economic partnerships beyond just the U.S. They reportedly saw the new Syrian government as a potential Iran counterweight and encouraged U.S. engagement there.
Egypt's walking a tightrope.
Egypt's navigating that complex path, trying to maintain close U.S. ties while firmly opposing certain U.S. Gaza proposals, especially anything hinting at Palestinian displacement.
And Iran. Squeezed, but with an opening.
Iran finds itself subject to renewed U.S. maximum pressure, but also presented with that nuclear deal olive branch, creates significant challenges, but also very narrow potential openings.
So the overall trend is diversification, hedging.
Overall, yes. The perception of a more unpredictable, transactional U.S. policy, combined with global power shifts, is compelling many Middle Eastern states to actively diversify foreign and security partnerships. Hedging.
Makes sense.
It's a rational response to potentially less reliable alliances, abrupt U.S. priority changes. They're not necessarily abandoning U.S. ties, but supplementing them with a wider array. Russia, China, even regional rivals like the Saudi-Iran dialogue.
Like Europe adapting.
There's advice being given to GCC states. Watch how Europe adjusts to a potentially diminished U.S. security role, proactively diversify, invest in domestic success. Iran's eastward pivot is a similar strategy.
Makes diplomacy more complex.
This complex, evolving web of overlapping, sometimes conflicting relationships makes regional diplomacy much more intricate, less predictable. States constantly recalibrating based on perceived shifts in multiple great powers policies, leading to more fluid, less ideologically rigid alignments.
Okay, so let's try to bring all these incredibly complex threads together. Looking ahead from May 2025, what's the overall trajectory for stability in the Middle East? Are we moving towards more stability or less?
Well, the Middle East in 2025, it feels increasingly defined by these new wars of attrition. The immense human suffering in Gaza has just shattered hopes for near-term regional peace. It's starkly exposed the limitations of international intervention.
And power dynamics are shifting.
We're seeing significant shifts, yeah. Some observers see a potential Sunni-led resurgence, setbacks for Shia factions linked to Iran. But overall, escalating conflicts, pervasive political turmoil, severe economic struggles. It's all deepening instability and insecurity.
And the big fear, Israel-Iran.
The heightened tensions between Israel and Iran amplify those fears of a direct military confrontation. The World Bank even highlighted a concerning wider trend of increasing violence across the region.
It's not just one crisis, is it? They're all linked.
Crucially, yes. The region's grappling with multiple simultaneous crises: Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran-Israel tensions, and they are deeply interlinked, mutually exacerbating.
Like Syria's collapse, creating new problems.
Exactly. Assad's regime collapsing creates a new power vacuum, potential for more instability, proxy competition. The region has this long history where conflict in one area easily spills over,
Making the current situation exceptionally volatile.
the current confluence of crises, especially the Gaza war's intensity and repercussions, weakened Iranian proxies, uncertain Syria, creates an exceptionally volatile, unpredictable environment. Hopes for regional peace are shattered. The risk of miscalculation, unintended escalation between major actors is alarmingly high. Houthi attacks linked to Gaza's solidarity. Israeli actions in Syria or Lebanon potentially drawing others in. It's not just oscillated conflicts, it points towards a potential systemic erosion of regional order.
Weakened actors don't mean stability.
Weakened actors don't automatically mean stability. They can create dangerous power vacuums. The sheer number of active crises increases this risk of conflict contagion, making comprehensive peace exceptionally challenging. It needs a holistic approach, not piecemeal efforts.
Given this extremely volatile environment, what role can international diplomacy realistically play? Can it steer things towards stability or at least away from more escalation? What are the limits?
International diplomatic efforts are certainly ongoing, but their effectiveness is often significantly constrained by the sheer complexity of the conflicts, by those deep divisions among global powers we talked about.
The UN's role.
The UN remains a central forum, yes, but the Security Council is frequently hampered, especially on Israel-Palestine. However, UN agencies like UNRWA play that indispensable humanitarian role, particularly in Gaza, despite huge challenges, restrictions, attacks, funding issues.
And legal avenues.
International legal bodies like the ICJ, ICC are pursuing accountability. UN Secretary General Guterres consistently advocates for ceasefires, aid, a two-state solution, and the U.S. has called for a UNSC role in Syria's stabilization.
What about regional bodies? Arab League, GCC?
They're active, too. The Arab League has its post-conflict plan for Gaza, condemns Israeli actions, supports Palestinian rights. The GCC is increasingly focused on de-risking, de-escalation, diplomatic engagement, even with Iran, and they're key partners in Trump's economic initiatives.
But the limitations of diplomacy seem stark right now.
They've been starkly exposed by the Gaza war, yes. There's this palpable sense of the impotence of the international community, the UN, the great powers to decisively intervene.
Skepticism about multilateral bodies.
Some analyses, even within U.S. policy circles, characterize certain multinational bodies as irrelevant, or worse, reflecting deep skepticism about their effectiveness.
Leading to a search for alternatives.
Consequently, yes, the perceived failures of established institutions like the UNSC are leading to this discernible search for alternative, supplementary diplomatic mechanisms.
Like regional groups stepping up. Ad hoc mediation.
We see regional organizations like the Arab League, GCC, proactively proposing solutions, ad hoc mediation, Qatar, Egypt on Gaza, Oman on U.S.-Iran becoming more prominent, and the Trump administration's preference for bilateral deals, flexible coalitions, further encourages this trend away from traditional multilateralism.
More polycentric diplomacy.
Resulting in a more polycentric diplomatic landscape, exactly. The challenge is ensuring these various efforts are complementary, reinforcing international law and norms.
Success depends on.
The success of these newer frameworks will depend on their inclusivity, legitimacy, and ability to deliver tangible results where older structures have faltered.
Okay, final thoughts. Looking ahead, what are the biggest potential scenarios, the key risks that could really destabilize things further, and maybe? Are there any fragile glimmers of hope on the horizon?
The trajectory is fraught with risks, definitely. But there are also some fragile paths towards de-escalation, maybe stability.
Biggest risks first.
Primary risks. Gaza conflict escalating into a wider regional war, potentially that direct Iran-Israel confrontation. Collapse of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks leading to an Iranian nuclear breakout, raising the specter of preemptive strikes. Further destabilization of shipping routes, Red Sea, Hormuz. Failure to address the Gaza humanitarian crisis leading to long-term radicalization. And deepening rifts among major global powers undermining peace efforts.
Okay. Any glimmers of hope? Anything positive?
Potential glimmers. The continuation of U.S.-Iran talks, despite difficulties, offers a pathway. Sustained, deepened Saudi-Iranian rapprochement could have a significant positive impact. The increasing assertiveness of regional actors, Egypt, Qatar, GCC, Arab League, leading to more locally owned peace processes, that's encouraging.
Could the sheer scale of the Gaza crisis force action?
Possibly. The sheer scale of the humanitarian catastrophe might compel stronger, more unified international action. And the Syria transition, if managed carefully and inclusively, could present an opportunity for stabilization and reducing malign external influences.
So it feels like more than just another conflict cycle, a reordering.
I think so. The Middle East in 2025 isn't just another cycle. It feels like a fundamental reordering of power, influence, alignments, exacerbated by regional dynamics and global power shifts. The post-Cold War order, U.S. dominance, it's visibly fraying.
A multipolar struggle.
Multiple actors, regional powers, external powers, non-state actors vying for influence in an increasingly multipolar environment. Long-standing conflicts like Israeli-Palestinian reaching new intensity, while new fault lines emerge post-Assad Syria, Yemen. The unwritten rules of the game are being rewritten with diminished adherence to norms and institutions.
A decade of disruption.
It's quite possible the Middle East is navigating a protracted decade of disruption until a new, more stable equilibrium is found. The current high tension, the crises, could unfortunately be a painful but unavoidable part of that recalibration.
Where does hope lie then?
Any real hope for a more peaceful future lies in the emergence of new, more effective diplomatic frameworks and in key regional actors increasingly prioritizing de-escalation and economic cooperation over conflict and rivalry. We see hints of that in the GCC's de-risking.
But the path is dangerous.
However, the path ahead will be fraught with risks of major escalations, humanitarian catastrophes, geopolitical uncertainty. The central question remains, can pragmatism, diplomacy, a shared interest in stability ultimately overcome the deep-seated rivalries, historical grievances, and extremist ideologies still fueling conflict?
The Middle East in 2025 is indeed at an incredibly precarious point. The immense human cost of these complex power struggles. It has profound implications for global stability. While the challenges are, well, undeniably daunting, the ongoing diplomatic efforts and these shifting regional calculations do offer narrow but vital pathways forward. Understanding these intricate dynamics, as we've tried to do today, is really the crucial first step in navigating this uncertain future. Join us next time on The Deep Dive.
Examine and unravel another complex issue.
Thank you for joining us today.